What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video we are featuring a 2014 RX350. We're going to do rear brakes on it. They are warped, the rotors are warped and they're pulsating when you brake. Very annoying. It's a very easy job, so let's get started. First thing you want to do is jack up your car right underneath the rear differential if it's an all-wheel drive. If it's not an all-wheel drive, it's probably still going to have the same jacking spot, but you can see there's a little nub on the subframe. That's where you want to put your jack to lift the rear end evenly. I'm going to place my jack stands right here. That's a good area to put your jack stands in the rear, or you can put them on the pinch welds, but this is sturdy and these types of jack stands will most likely bend your pinch rail. Alright, once you have the car raised and supported safely on jack stand, go ahead and remove the wheel. First thing I'm going to do is break the bleeder screw free. That way it'll be easier for me to open it once the caliper is off to retract the piston. Break it free, snug it up. Next, with a 14mm, remove these two caliper mounting bolts. Take them out all the way and remove your caliper. I'm going to set it aside on top of the rotor. That way it doesn't put any pressure on the brake hose. Remove your brake pads. Next, with a 17mm, go ahead and break free the caliper bracket mounting bolts. These are pretty tight. Okay, remove both of those. Hold the caliper bracket so it doesn't fall, and remove your caliper bracket. Next, remove your brake rotor. If for some reason it does not come off, obviously make sure you don't have your parking brake engaged, and if it's not engaged and it's not coming off, pop off this little cover. That way you can de-adjust your parking brake shoes, make them more narrow so that it can release the brake rotor. You also want to pop off this cover so we can reinstall it on the new rotor. Set your old rotor aside and let's clean up this whole hub area. I'm going to start by using a wire brush all over this hub. This one's actually very clean, but make sure you have no rust chunks or flakes or anything like that stuck on your hub, because when you put your new rotor on, if you do have those things, it's going to make it not sit flush and then you're going to have braking issues. Use some brake parts cleaner and clean up the parking brake area as well as the hub. While this is drying off, let's disassemble our caliper bracket. So take off your hardware, little spring retainers for the pads, throw those away. Next, you want to remove your slider pins. One of them will have a rubber O-ring. Remember where that one goes. Because this one has it, I'm going to actually put this back and do them one at a time. That way I don't accidentally confuse them and put this one up here. They're designed like this for a reason, so I'm going to make sure I keep them the way they're supposed to be. With a rag or a paper towel, clean up the slider pin and inspect it. Make sure it's not rusty. Make sure there's no rust up here. If it's just a little bit of surface rust, that's okay. You can take a wire brush to it and clean it up as best as you can. But basically, having this area clean ensures that the boot seals up and it doesn't let any moisture in there, which in that case would create further rust. So my grease was actually pretty fresh, but if you have old grease or if it's dry or if you have rust, take a bore brush, put it in there. This is what a bore brush looks like. It goes in there, put some brake clean it up. In my case, because I have fresh grease, I'm just gonna add more grease. This is what I'm using, silicone paste. It is meant for higher temperatures, so it's good for brakes. You don't wanna use anything that can melt at high temperatures. So re-grease the pin. Make sure you get some grease up there in the groove. I'm going to take a little bit extra and put it inside of the boot. Work it in and insert your freshly cleaned slider pin. push it in all the way, twist it around, and then squeeze the boot. Make sure you get out any extra grease or air. Now you do the same to the other slider pin. All right, the next step, after you've cleaned and greased both of your caliper pins, you're gonna want to clean up the area where the spring retainers go. So right here, if they are severely rusted, you're gonna have to grind the area off to make it flat again and clean. In my case, it's clean. It just has a little bit of brake dust and some surface rust. So a wire brush will do the trick for me. Clean it well on both sides. Take some of your brake grease, or in my case, silicone paste. Put just a tiny bit on each end. You don't want a lot because you don't want this to get into the area where the rotor goes. And then you take your spring retainers and you put them so that the spring faces the inner part of the caliper. Press it on all the way and just repeat the process for all 4 corners. Okay, make sure they're pressed down all the way. Now that this is dry, add some anti-seize to the hub. This is going to prevent further rust. It's going to allow the rotor to be free next time you do a brake job. It won't seize it to the hub, and it's going to ensure that rust doesn't build up and create any sort of braking issues down the road. Take your new rotor. If you do not have the special coated rotors that I provided in the description, you want to clean them up with Brake Clean, because they will have a Cosmoline oil coating from the factory so that they don't rust. Mine do not have that coating. At this point, you want to put the rotor on and you want to listen. Spin the wheel and listen for the parking brake shoes. I actually don't hear them on this side, so it sounds like they need to be adjusted a little bit. I do hear them on the other side, and I know they're perfect because I already did the other side brakes. So in this case, take off the rotor, and right down here, there's a little adjuster wheel. If you pull on it towards you, it'll expand the shoes. So I'm just going to expand them a tiny bit, put the rotor back on. Okay, I still don't hear them. Expand it a little bit more. Put the rotor on. That's it. The perfect adjustment is when you can just barely hear them touch, but they don't actually drag onto the rotor. You can also make this adjustment later through this hole. Put your plug back in. Clean up any fingerprints off the rotor surface. Make sure this area is clean too, where the wheel mounts. With everything cleaned and properly adjusted, lubricated, let's install the caliper bracket back. Torque these bracket to knuckle bolts to 58 foot-pounds. And install your brand new brake pads. Make sure they go in easily and they slide around easily. If they did not slide around, that means either your springs are not sitting in properly or you have rust compressing the 2 ends of the brake pads. Next, it's time to compress the caliper piston, and that means squeezing it back so that it makes room for the extra thickness of the brake pads. This is where the bleeder screw comes into place. You don't have to open it. I prefer to open it though, because that allows the old fluid to go out, and it also prevents fluid from going back the opposite way through the lines. If for some reason your bleeder screw is seized but your caliper is good, which by the way you would know if it's dry. If it's leaking, it's no good. If it's dry and it compresses easily, you're good to go. But if for some reason your bleeder screw is seized, leave it and just compress it very slowly. Otherwise, I suggest that you open it. You do that with a 10mm wrench. Before I open it, I'm actually going to add a hose to this so that the fluid doesn't go spraying out everywhere. It's going to be a more controlled bleed. Okay, add a hose. Grab your wrench. Crack the bleeder screw free. I'm going to collect the fluid in this cup here. Next, you want to get an old brake pad. It has to be an old one because otherwise you are going to ruin the new one. Put it up against the piston and then use your caliper depression tool, which I will have linked in the description. Insert that just like this, and then you want to squeeze the caliper piston in. This caliper is actually going in so easily that my tool wants to fall off of here as I tighten. There you go, remove your tool. If this outer boot bulges out, it's probably just because there's air trapped in there. Push it back in, It's no big deal. At this point, give the caliper a second for all the air to make its way out. Snug up your bleeder screw. Put your boot back to protect the bleeder screw from any debris. Also, if your caliper has all these rust chunks in here, make sure you scrape them off. This is not necessarily something that would indicate a bad caliper, unless obviously this is so weak you can puncture right through it. But scrape off as much as you can. And then I'm going to add a little bit of the same silicone paste right here to the caliper piston. That'll seal up against the pad, and do the same to these two ears. I don't suggest putting it on the back of the pad because it just makes a huge mess everywhere. One of the last steps is to put your caliper back on. Start in your 2 bolts, and we're going to torque these to 32 foot-pounds. Last thing is to put on the wheel. Start on your lug nuts, snug them up, and then we'll torque them to 76 foot-pounds. With the parking brake applied, torque these to 76 foot-pounds. Last thing to do is to put the car back on the ground. So that sums up the brake job video. You always want to do brakes in pairs, left and right, not just one side. And once you've completed the job, you want to take the car for a road test. And when you get in the car, press the brake pedal a few times before you start it. That way you compress the pads up against the rotor. And you want to drive it to burnish the brakes. And that means that you get them warm and then hot in order to mate the new pads to the new rotors. It creates a perfect surface for them to grab onto. So drive the car 20-30 miles an hour, slow down, go up to 40, slow down, and then get up to highway speeds if you can. Slow down. Don't overheat them. Obviously, you don't want to get brake fade, but make them a little warm. It might smell, but obviously don't go too hard on them, and that'll ensure that the pads and the rotors mate perfectly. And before you go on that road test, you want to make sure you check your master cylinder. Mine is actually a little bit low, so I'm going to fill it up with .3 brake fluid, as it says on the cap. Go up to the max line. So I hope the video was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Leave any comments that you might have in the description below. And having said that, I will see you in the next one.